Hello and welcome back to the Sideboard here at GP Richmond. I'm Nick Miller alongside Brian Kibler. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm a little tired, but I'm doing well.
And you're tired, of course, because you got here right before you.
Yeah, I had kind of a ridiculous journey to get here. I had a work engagement last night in Austin. I was speaking on a panel in the Gaming Expo at South by Southwest, and but I didn't want to miss this. So I took a ridiculous flight this morning, got up at 4 a.m., was on a plane at 6 a.m., and got in here, during my buys. So I managed to have a little bit of time to, recoup and get a little food, but then it was right into battle.
Gotta take advantage so you can bash some zoo.
Yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed playing Modern, testing for the Pro Tour, playing at the Pro Tour. I was really happy with the sort of general structure of the deck that I played. I felt like it was a good choice for the field, and wanted a chance to play it again.
And of course, you published this deck in your article this week. Explain why you're sticking with it, and why you love this deck so much.
So, I really love aggressive mid-range strength decks. I like decks that can put pressure on opponents, but also have the tools to have flexible answers and can take sort of different positions in different kinds of matchups. I played a very similar sort of Naya deck during the Modern season prior to the recent bannings and unbannings, and that deck was largely a metagame deck. A lot of the cards in that, like Locked on Smiter, Domery, were all sort of aimed specifically at beating a field of like Blue, White, Red, and Jund, which was a lot of the field then. And now I get Wild Nikotl. And Wild Nikotl gives you a whole different dimension to the deck where you actually get to have these like super powerful aggressive starts that are very difficult for people to deal with, even if they're sort of prepared for the general kind of thing you're trying to do.
Now, did the results of the Pro Tour affect how you've built your deck? Because a lot of people felt like, well, Zoo is dropping off in popularity. Did you use that, going forward, knowing you were going to play this, to alter any cards, change any sideboard slots?
I made a couple of changes. At the Pro Tour, I was playing a sort of more targeted sideboard. I had Fulminator Mage and Tectonic Edge, which I felt were strong cards against like Blue, White, Red, and against Scape Shift. Here, it's a huge tournament. Yeah. There's, almost 4,500 players here, and it's very difficult to sort of try and predict that kind of metagame. You have to be prepared for a much broader sort of field, and I wanted to play more sort of high-impact cards against a broader variety of decks, so I went to play Blood Moon. That's one of the big changes with this deck versus my Pro Tour deck, and that sort of informs a number of the other decisions. At the Pro Tour, I played Elspeth as sort of the top end of my curve, but I don't want to have double white spells in my deck if I'm going to have Blood Moon in the matchups, so I ended up going with Thundermaw Hellkite at the top end of my curve as sort of my finisher that I can cast even if I have Blood Moon.
With Blood Moon. How has Thundermaw Hellkite been? And what are your thoughts on it versus Stormbreath Dragon that a few people in the room have been switching over to get around like Path to Exile?
I think Thundermaw Hellkite is excellent. It's a little expensive in some matchups, but a huge haste body can't be Abrupt Decayed. In the first match I played today, I ripped a pretty timely Thundermaw Hellkite on camera to take out my opponent's Liliana and then end up finishing the game with it. Stormbreath Dragon is interesting, and it's a card that I considered. The fact that it can't be lightning bolted, or rather it doesn't die to at least a single lightning bolt, and can't die to a combination of Bolt and Helix because it has pro-white. That's quite relevant against Blue, White, Red. I think that if Blue, White, Red were sort of my primary target, then Stormbreath Dragon would be the go-to card. Right. But the fact that Thundermaw Hellkite can, kill a swarm of Bitter Blossom tokens if those show up, it kills Birds of Paradise, can fight through, basically guaranteed damage because of the trigger. Even if your opponent has a bunch of small flying creatures, you can get by all of them and get a bunch of damage.
Now, Domery is a card that I've been talking a lot about with, on the Open Series for its standard applications. How good has it been for you in Modern?
Domery is really powerful in Modern. I think that it is a really underrated card in Modern. It was a sort of a centerpiece of the Naya deck that I played in the previous Modern season, and I think it's a little less powerful now because it was at its best against decks like Jund. Planeswalkers are particularly powerful in sort of other mid-range or against control decks, whereas the current standard format has moved a little bit more toward a number of combo decks, and some of the decks aren't necessarily places where Domery's great. But I still have 2 copies of it because it's kind of like a removal spell in some matchups, and in other matchups it's a card advantage engine that can just take over the game.
Now you talked about Blood Moon in your sideboard. How about some other tricks? I see you've got a Rule of Law, where a lot of people say you don't really want it anymore.
Well, I think that Storm was the most popular deck at the Pro Tour, or not the most popular, the most successful in terms of raw win percentage. And while I think it's likely that more people are targeting Storm, a lot of people might not want to play Storm because they're afraid of being targeted. I think that it's important to have some cards that are just stone cold killers,
yes.
the matchups that you want. Modern is a format where there's a huge variety of very powerful decks, and the Sideboard cards are very powerful against these linear strategies. So a card like Rule of Law, a lot of the Storm decks basically are just dead to it. They have maybe one Echoing Truth that they can possibly draw if you play a Rule of Law. So I like having access to that kind of thing. It's also good in matchups like Living End, clearly, as well as against like the Goryo's Vengeance decks. A lot of them need to, Faithless Looting Vengeance in a single turn in order to hit you with Emrakul. So if you have Rule of Law in play, they can't do that.
Yeah, a lot of people have called Modern a format about sideboarding because how powerful the sideboard cards are. Of course, you have Choke, one of the most hateful sideboard cards.
The number of people who see, I tell them, they're like, oh, what's in your sideboard? And it's like, I have Choke. They're like, that's legal? You can play that? It's like, well, you can, and in many cases you should because it is incredibly powerful.
Yeah. And of course, Thalia, talk about how good she is and the matches you bring her.
So Thalia is an interesting card because Thalia isn't as high power a card as, say, Rule of Law in the matchups where Rule of Law is good. But Thalia has applications in a lot of different matchups. You can play Thalia against like Bullet Control. And it makes it that much more difficult for them to, efficiently use their mana to stop what you're doing. You can play Thalia against Burn. One of the important things about the way that Burn operates is that it's a low land count deck, and it needs to be able to cast a number of cheap spells in a single turn in order to actually, finish you off. But if you have a Thalia, it really messes up their math.
Collateral damage, Thalia just doles out to the decks that don't expect it.
Right. One of the important things about Modern, about sideboarding in Modern, is that it's a huge format. It's an incredibly diverse format, especially at a tournament like this, where there's so many players, and having cards like Rule of Law is good in moderation. You don't want your entire sideboard to be Rule of Laws because you need to have overlaps with different matchups. And Thalia is a sort of card that has a lot of overlap in a lot of different matchups. It can give you, sort of a great tool against any kind of spell-heavy control style deck or combo deck.
Right. And being just a wide open format, early rounds we saw a lot of Burn. That she's brought up the Thalia interaction. Just a lot of crazy decks that are just running around in the early stages and having a not so targeted sideboard, but a broad sideboard.
I mean, I have one Rule of Law, I have one Ethos, one Canonist, then I have two copies of Thalia. And if that was, say, two Rule of Laws and two Canonists, my deck would be stronger against a deck like Storm or Living End. But I would have, two fewer sideboard slots for who knows how many different matches. And it's really important to get the most out of your sideboard slots. If you know what the metagame's going to be, you can target it, you have it nailed down perfectly, great. Play the best cards for those matchups. But that's not something you can really do in a format as diverse as Modern. You really need to have cards that have overlap and a lot of value in different places.
All right. Well, the deck book's sweet. You made quite the trek to get here, so I wish you good luck for the rest of the tournament.
Thank you very much.
For Brian Kibler, I am Nick Miller here in the Sideboard at GP Richmond. Stay tuned all weekend long for more action.